Check 1, 2. Just checking to see if you can hear me and see me okay. Hello, everybody. Cool. So David's here. Raylan from Minnesota. Tony, Randolph, David, James, Joe, Lindsay, Jeff, Ricky is back. Francis is back. Sam, Angelo, Maz. Cool. I'm glad you're all here. Todd is back. Awesome. Thank you, Todd. Hello from mid-Missouri. Very cool. Awesome. Good. I'm glad you all can hear me and see me okay. So we're going to get started and try and get you some stuff to practice for Juan from Argentina. Hello, Juan. Rob is here. David's here. Peter. Awesome. Thank you, everybody, so much for taking time out of your day to hang out and talk some guitar. Now, remember, we can literally talk about anything to do with guitar, whether it's guitar picks to guitar strings to guitar pickups to performance to practice to gear of any kind to mindset to frustration, all these different things. Hey, Gary, nice to hear from you, buddy. Hoping to see you again sometime in the near future. We'll be back at GearFest, of course, and it'd be nice to see you then. Scott and Greg and Paul, let's talk turkey. Oh, that's great. Yes. So hopefully you've got some good plans for Thanksgiving. It sounds like we're going to get some snow here, but that's okay. It is almost December, so I'm okay with that. Anyway, so let's go ahead and get started here. I'm going to go down the Q&A that I've got that some of you already put your questions in. I'll start there, and then I'll make my way over to the chat. Okay? So I got to do this text wrap again. There we go. Now, I know we've had a number of questions about scales and positions of scales and different kinds of things like that. So let's say here. So Angelo, let's start with Angelo. Larry, hey Larry. So Angelo, let's start with you. And hold on a second. I'm going to move that over here so I can see it better. Scott says, do I ride snowmobiles? I do not. I used to when I was younger, in my teenage years, my early 20s. I haven't ridden a snowmobile in quite a long time. So winter for me usually means travel, and because that's when NAMM and all that stuff starts. So I tend to travel each month, and a lot of practice indoors. So no, I wish I still rode, but it's been a long time. So let's see here. Randolph. So I relate the modal scales with my diatonic positions. Okay, and we'll talk about that in just a second here, because that's a whole funky thing to try and kind of figure out in your brain, but we'll get to that. Hey, Mark. So, Angelo, let's get back to Angelo. So he says, can you play a simple, for example, 3 to 4 chord sequence and then show us a few ideas of soloing across it while explaining the theory? Sure, and I just kind of did this in the last class, but let me see if I can find a backing track really quick without wasting too much time here. Give me 1 second. I usually keep all my saved ones in here. I just got to see if I've got something. No. None of those are what I'm looking for. Oh, I think I found it. Let me try this. Yeah, this'll work. Now I gotta get my chat back up, get all my stuff back up. Okay, so 3 to 4 chord sequence, and then show us a few ideas of soloing across it. So the thing to understand is that when you're soloing, and I talk about this all the time when it comes to soloing, but the trick to soloing is you've got to try and find a balance between phrasing, groove, melody, and then whatever you feel like should be above and beyond that. Like if you're more into technical kinds of things, you might throw something in there if you want to throw some licks or something like that. Hey, John. So Yeah, so the big thing here, like this little example here, what I'm doing is I'm playing G major, and then I'm going to B minor, and then I'm going to C major, and then I'm going to D major. Now the first step with soloing over any kind of chord sequence like this, now if I was doing something with metal, you know, with fast power chords and it was all kind of chromatic stuff, my approach would be very different. But if I had a 3 to 4 chord sequence that I'm trying to think about how to solo over, the first thing I'd do is I would decide what scales do I know, what positions do I know, what do I understand about this key. Before I ever go into soloing over this, I gotta be prepared on some level. Because if I'm not, every time I solo, I'm just gonna go to the first position of pentatonic and that's where I'm gonna live, right? So in looking at this chord progression, I'm thinking to myself, I have a 1, 3, 4, 5. That's what I'm using in the key of G. So now for you, and you can kind of work along with me as we do this, especially if you've got your solo. Hey, Mark, your solo. If you've got your guitar with you, I gotta slow my brain down a little bit here. So let's say all you knew was pentatonic, right? And you saw this chord progression and you thought to yourself, and maybe you can even kind of play along with me here. If I saw G, B minor, C, and D, what pentatonic scale would I use? Okay, if I saw G major, B minor, C major, and D major, what pentatonic scale would I use? Okay, I'll give you just a second there. Hey, Paul, I'll have you answer this for me. It usually takes just a few seconds to go back and forth. Okay, so G major, B minor, C major, and D major. Okay, we'll actually go all the way back with this a little bit and let you build this whole thing. So you now know what chords are in this song. It's G major, B minor, C major, D major. Okay? All right, so the first thing we got to do is decide that we're in G major, right? So for me, the first thing I would do is I would think I've got a 1, 4, 5, because I know my 1, 4, 5 is major, and then I've got a 3 chord, which is the B minor. So I've got a 1 chord, a 4 chord, a 5 chord, and a 3 chord, in whatever order they're going to be in, okay? But that's what I would be in, is G major using a 1, a 3, a 4, and a 5. Okay, so now I've got that information. Now I've got to go to my guitar and go, what can I see to solo with? Okay, so if I was going to use G major pentatonic, G minor pentatonic would not sound as good because this song, and again, you have to know about the logic of this stuff, and I don't know what guitar courses you own, but if I solo G minor over the G major chord progression, it may work from a pentatonic bluesy perspective, but if it doesn't, it's just going to sound like I'm in the wrong key. Okay? Now that isn't what I would opt for. I would more opt for doing the G major pentatonic, which means I would go up to G, and I would play G major pentatonic. Okay? Yep, Play Guitar for Life later in here, I talk about how to know what to solo over when. We talk about basic theory like the 1, 4, 5, things like that, which is all what this stuff is. It just takes time to get comfortable with. So, just follow me here. Even if you're beyond this, we're going to get there, but let me just build. So step number 1 is, I now know what key this jam track is in. I know what chords it's using. And I even know when the chords are changing, which is really important because just in a minute, I'm going to start making changes with them. So I've got G, then B minor, 1, 2, 3, 4, C, D, 2, 3, 4, G. Okay, so now I know where the changes are. Okay, so the next step is let's say I just knew pentatonic, and that's all I know is pentatonic. So I go in here, and I try and solo over the top. Well, I don't know what I'm doing. I know what the chord progression is, and I'm just going to start moving around. So I start doing this. Okay. Now, all the notes are going to function, but you'll notice there's a bit of a disconnect between what's happening with that song and what I'm doing. So the first thing I do is I start trying to make some sort of melodic connection. Now, I'm going to phrase a little bit, and again, we're not going to go into all this because I got a lot of questions to get into, but I would certainly phrase, right? I'm going to try and make it sound musical somehow. But the first step, that what I can do is I can just start trying to target the G, because I know that I'm in the key of G, so G would be a good note to try and target in my solo. So as this starts playing, okay, well that's better, right? At least I got something happening there. Okay, so the next step might be I'm going to try and emphasize G over G, and B over B, and C over C, and D over D, which again is pretty elementary, but it's a great place to start if I don't know how to do this. Now, if I only know this position on the guitar, that's what I got to work with. If I know other positions, of course, I can start getting more creative throughout other positions, right? But I got to know where G's are, or B's are, or C's are, or D's are, or whatever. So now I know when they're coming up because I've listened to the backing track and I know the changes because I've studied them. Now I go to my guitar and I start thinking about it. Well, G, okay, and here comes B. So I could go to B, but I got to know where B is. Okay, here comes C. Now this is interesting. C isn't part of my pentatonic, so I'm going to have to add it in. See that? Because I got to find C. Well, B and C are right next to each other. And then D would be up from there. So now all of a sudden I've just added this brand new note into my pentatonic that I didn't have before. Well, Maz, before you start worrying about all the notes all over the fretboard, start with just somewhere. Like, don't overkill, because if you go, okay, I got to know all the notes, well, now you're off on another race over here, and you're not jamming, right? That's the part you got to be careful with, is just always going back into the rudimentary bucket, and, you know, well, I got to practice, and 6 months from now, I'll know all the notes on my fretboard. Well, you could be learning how to play before then. So don't think about it as all over the fretboard. Start with somewhere. Even if it's just one position on the guitar that you can start making music with. You're B.B. King for the most part, and I'm not being negative. I'm being honest. Like, every guitar player isn't just ripping around the fretboard all the time. You know, again, I'm not going to name anybody because people think I'm trying to dog them, and I'm not. I'm just saying, yeah, one position at a time, like Randolph said. Just start with something. So now listen to my solo. So again, it's not incredibly busy and has all this wonderful stuff, but it's got a purpose now. For the first time, my solo's got a purpose because I'm trying to direct myself toward these places. Now, if I don't know where B is or something, I might have to take a little time and work with this a little bit, okay? Spend a little time with this. Now, for those of you that know even more, I'm just going to go a little bit more just to bring this to the next level. So then the next thing I start doing is I try and start visualizing, for instance, the cage system on the fretboard, which might mean I need to get out of this position that I'm in and start looking somewhere else. But just bear with me, and if I get over your head, just stay with me for a little bit, because I want to give this to everybody that's watching, okay? So if I'm soloing here on the fretboard, and that's all I know, okay, then I've got to see something there. So watch this. If I was to take this G chord, I'm just playing a 4-finger G, and I move it up an octave. So now I'm on 15, 14, 15, 15. And the zeros then would become 12s, right? So technically I got 15, 14, 12, 12, 15, 15. Now I can't physically play all that, okay, I can't play a 4-finger G and bar at the same time because I don't have enough fingers. But I can visualize it. So when I go to solo over the top, this is what cage study is, or chord chasing, or all kinds of different ways. There's different ways I view these things on the guitar. But so I'm visualizing that G major chord. So now instead of just going to G, I could go to any of these notes. And now I'm using the pentatonic scale as a vehicle to move me around to these other notes in the G. Okay, so then so we start studying that, and we practice that for a while. Okay, and again, I know I'm rushing through this because we only got so much time, but I'm showing you the evolution of this. So then what happens is I've got a B minor chord that comes up next. Well, I could visualize my B minor chord right here, 1 octave higher, which means I now have 14, 16, 16, 15, 14. So I'm visualizing that chord up here. So it's kind of in the same area that I know my pentatonic, right? Okay, so now when that B minor chord comes up, I'm going to try and target one of these other notes of the B minor. Okay? Now, what's cool about the B minor, if you look at the B minor chord, is this note right here is the 14th fret. Now, that wasn't even a pentatonic note. But now, all of a sudden, I got this brand new note in here that I could use right there, which sounds really, really cool. Okay? And then the C chord comes up. Well, I got a regular C here, but if I move that up an octave, which means I'd be on 15, 14, 0 or 12, and then 13, and then 12 again, right? Now again, I'll post this in the Masterclass group. So there's the C chord right there. And then I've got the D chord, which is just this 1 octave higher. And I'd play this 12. So now I'm visualizing that, you see? So now all of a sudden, what I can do is... Now again, I'm going to keep it really basic. But I'm just going to try and kind of target some of those notes. So G, here comes B, here comes C, and then D, so I just have this basic outline of trying to visualize some of these chords. Now, again, depending on where you are in your journey, if you know more positions and more places to go, that's where the fun really starts kicking in. Is you could be playing over G, and then here comes B minor, and then here comes C, D, there's the G, here comes B minor, here comes C, so I gotta get to a C, and then D. See, and all of a sudden you're all over the fretboard doing some really cool stuff over this chord progression. See what I mean? It's just, that's kind of the way this whole thing works. Now, it might make sense to you, but the big thing is start trying to just work with little pieces of this as you keep going. And then sometimes when you're soloing, you might decide, you know, you're jamming and you just want to go off the rails for a while, right? So now you're kind of old school the way you were before, where you're not really paying attention to all these chords, right? So now you're in a space where you're going... Then you come back. See, and then you're back again. So that's kind of the fun of this. Is what I do is I take these kinds of chord progressions. I love playing over all styles of music. You know, blues is a little bit different from pop music, which I would call this more of a pop style chord progression. And those are different from, you know, hard rock or metal stuff. And so you develop a way of kind of approaching your fretboard over any of these, but you don't have to feel intimidated like you have to know your whole fretboard, and you got to know all the notes on your fretboard, and you got to know all the cage system. If you can just start with something, okay? And again, I don't want to waste your whole time on this, but I'll end by saying this. Anyway, I'll get into that. But I always think of it like this. So many times I hear people play along with backing tracks. And what happens is, I use this analogy. It's like two cars on the interstate that are driving next to each other that have no communication whatsoever. They don't know each other. They just happen to be driving the same speed limit, right? You're driving your car and somebody's going to pass you, and all of a sudden, for some reason, they don't pass you, and now you're uncomfortably driving next to each other 75 miles an hour on the interstate, right? And you don't really want to look at each other, and there's nothing you can say because you're in two different vehicles. That's what happens a lot when people jam with backing tracks or jam even with bands that they're in, is they don't know enough about the musical situation they're finding themselves in. They haven't figured out what key it's in, or they haven't figured out what the proper scale is, or they don't know what the chord changes are or where the chord changes are. So when they go to solo over the top, they just move around inside a position. And then they wonder why it always sounds like they're just playing scales. Well, that's why. So the trick is you got to spend a little preparation trying to get ready, learning what is this chord progression and what is the scale I should be using, or what do I know about scales, or how do I want this solo to sound, or what am I trying to do? And you'll have more success in actually making that sound the way that you want. The car analogy is me often. Yeah, listen, I've been there a million times. I know how it is. And the problem with it is that sometimes when you're trying to do this, you'll get lucky. Like sometimes your jam will sound just great and you're like, wow, this is great. I feel really good. And then tomorrow you'll come back to it and it'll suck. And you go, well, what happened, right? It's because there's no consistency. You're just getting lucky sometimes. And it's okay. That's great. But the more you understand about the situation, the more that you prep before you go into the situation, the more you can figure out what you're going to do over it. Like you might find that a certain situation, again, musical situation, whether it's a backing track or something you're writing or a band that you're playing with, that there are certain situations that when you find yourself in those situations, you do a better job because it's in a key that you're comfortable with, in a tempo that's comfortable for you, right? With chords that make sense to you, versus something else that you just go, well, it's in A and I know A, and then you try and play it and you're not really making a connection. Maybe the groove is weird. Maybe the tempo's weird. Right? Maybe the chords, maybe there's some odd chord in there that's really throwing you off because it's not part of the key. It doesn't fit in the key, right? But you won't know any of that if you don't spend a little time trying to figure it out, right? So just think about that a little bit. Thank you, Gary. Gary says, Play Guitar for Life is awesome since you encourage students to start simple. Yeah, Play Guitar for Life. I mean, I've got a new blues course that's coming out, a soloing course where I really went back and tried to kind of dissect the way that I think about all the notes and my approach to playing, and I'm excited about it. But like Gary said, honestly, that Play Guitar for Life, what I love about it is it just goes step by step through these things and gives you just a little bit of food to chew, right? Just a little bit of stuff to ponder and try and work with a little bit, and you can jump around anywhere you want. But I'm telling you, I know I say this every time, and then I get all, deep on you guys, but life is too short. The big thing is you got to take the best stuff from over here in this fundamental bin, and you got to take that stuff, take the stuff that you're like, oh man, that's exciting. Like if you're excited right now over that and you go, man, I want to learn how to do that. That's the stuff you need to take over and put into this creative bin over here, this creative space, I call it. And that way you can work with it a little bit. I spend hours just trying to visualize movements. Just different ideas around the fretboard in a key, or I might look at the key of E. And I just screw around, Matt says, I've got Music Theory for Life. Music Theory for Life is a great course, but if you're not where we're talking about right now, Matt, I would wait with Music Theory for Life and I'd go for if you've got Play Guitar for Life, I would go with that for sure. Then hit Music Theory for Life. I would start with something more fundamental that you can actually use. How to Play Guitar in 8 Weeks. That's awesome. I love that one too. Slash chords, you got it. So Renzo says, can you explain slash chords a bit in the theory if there is any? Basically, an easy way to think about this, Renzo, is if you played piano, and of course I'm mirrored to you, but if I played piano, I could play a C chord. And then I could take this hand and I could put B in the bass, right? Or play a C chord and put A in the bass, right? I can do that because I have two hands and I can... Now, again, if you play piano, there's lots of other things you can do, but this is just a simple analogy. So I'm playing a C chord and I'm putting... B in the bass or something like that. Okay, when you're a guitar player, you only have one hand to do this stuff. So when you see a slash chord and it says like G/B or C/B, it's telling you to play the first thing as the chord and the second thing is the bass note. Okay, so for instance, a C/B, there's lots of ways I could do this, but I might play a C power chord, but then put B in the bass. Right? I always think of this. Right, that kind of sound, that's those big... However that goes, but that's those slash chords. Now sometimes you'll hear slash chords, it'll be like a D with F sharp in the bass. So you're going to play a D chord and put F sharp in the bass. So you get this. Right? That sort of thing. Yeah, 38 special, yeah. Although I don't know what key it's really in and that sort of thing, but you get the idea. So that's what slash chords are, okay? Perfect, Ron. That's awesome. I'm glad that helped you. Yeah, me too. 38 special. I remember sitting in school and drawing, like Molly Hatchet was one of my favorite ones to draw when I was in school, was the Molly Hatchet logo or Van Halen or whatever it might have been. Anyway. So let's keep going here. We've got, now John says, when playing the A minor pentatonic in position 1 and 2, I use the second finger to start the second position, and my first finger is there ready for the next strings, only playing up and down. But I notice that you start the second position on your first finger. Okay, that's a wonderful question, John. I'm not sure if John's out there or not. Yeah, so let me explain this to you. There's a lot of subjectiveness when it comes to guitar playing. Now again, when you're playing something from a fundamental practice regimen perspective where you're trying to develop something, like again, let's say I'm using my proper fingers, I'll call them, where I have 4 fingers for 4 frets. Okay, so when I'm using the proper fingers to play what I would call the first position of A minor pentatonic, which is this. Now you might call that something else, and that's fine, but if I call this the first position, the logistical way of playing this would be 1-4, 1-3, 1-3, 1-3, 1-4, 1-4. That's how you'd normally play this, okay? In the heat of battle, when you're actually soloing, though, there are many times that I will not play it that way because there are real-world things interacting with the logical or logistical way of playing, okay? So as I'm playing, I might wind up doing something like this with these 2 fingers, even though I was just told that these are the fingers I'm supposed to use. Well, if I was practicing from a regimented perspective, this makes perfect sense. But if I'm coming from a lick, where I'm doing something like that, and I needed my pinky out here for something else, or just to exercise that lick, to be able to actually play that lick, I need to use a different fingering or something like that. That's a real-world thing that's going to happen, and it's going to jar the practical element or the logistical element or the way I'm seeing it logistically. Does that make sense? So whenever you're practicing, like I remember, I'd sit and practice all my positions and I'd play them all with the proper fingerings and all that sort of thing. And then when I started learning how to jam, it seemed like I was really never coming from that perspective, because when you're improvising, you're not sure what lick you're coming from or what phrase you're coming from or what position you're coming from. You're just kind of all over the fretboard, right? So here's the question, which I'm understanding what John is asking. If I went to the second position of this, I would start with my middle finger, right? I mean, logistically, I would play 2-4, then 1-4, then 1-4, then 1-3, then 2-4, then 2-4. Give me 1 second here. Give me just 1 second. All right, sorry about that. My wife was looking for my daughter, and my daughter was in the bathtub, so she couldn't find her. Okay, anyway. So if I went to that second position and I was playing this, okay, I would play 2-4, 1-4, 1-4, 1-3, 2-4, 2-4 in a realistic, logistical perspective. But when would I ever actually play 2 and 4 as fingers, right? In reality, I would never want to wind up on those 2 fingers because they don't work very well together. So if I was really playing, I would totally want to be on 1 and 3. Because that's where my fingers, my ability is going to come from. All that stuff. Plus, I've got all my bluesy stuff. All that stuff exists around there because of the fingers that I'm using. So hopefully that makes sense, because that's a wonderful question, John. We look at things from the logistical perspective and how they actually work, and it's very important to practice those things, no doubt about it. But if I was actually playing an A, and then I drop down into that position, that second position, right there. See, if I was coming from 1 and 3 like this, I would totally drop into my 1 and 4 up here. Right? But if I was playing from here, and I had to drop into that, I wouldn't go to my 3 and 1 like I should. I'd go into 2 and 1 because my 2 is sitting right there. As weird as that might seem. Which oftentimes will drop me into a 1 and 2 like this. How weird is that? Or 1 and 3, I should say. So if I'm coming down this way, now when I move back up, that's where I'll go back to this one. Now if I approach these fingers, if I was coming from here, then I would totally drop into a 1 and 4. So I know that's kind of confusing, but I hope that makes sense, that when you start really learning how to solo, your fingers, you got to be ready for anything, which is why I always tell people to practice all your legato exercises, those hammer-on pull-off things and things like that, because when you're playing, like if I was looking at the third position of A minor pentatonic, which is 10 and 13 and 10 and 12, see, again, 1-4 would make sense, but I'd probably bend this. So I really wouldn't use 1-4 from the logistical side of practice. I probably wouldn't even use that, because that's... But if I came back like that, I might. So for me, there's no one way to roll with these things. It's just, if you're coming from somewhere and you drop in there, you're probably going to use some different fingers for that. So Randolph says, I used to feel like I had to walk my fingers up the fretboard, and then one day I realized I could just go to whatever note I want with whatever fingers make sense. Yeah, and that's half the battle. Like, I've always called them connection points, but which I know I've got a course that I released on all about connection points and the weirdness of what this is, only I don't know that I really... The title of it was very good because I don't remember what it was I called it, but it's all about that weirdness of connectivity of these positions as you're actually soloing realistically when you play, because that's one of the big things for me is when I'm looking at my fretboard and I'm trying to kind of move around. You know, your fingers have to kind of roll with, and you practice, obviously, as you keep practicing things. You know, you practice all these various movements, but I always think the most important thing is when you shift into something new, your fingers have to reformulate around what's going to happen next, right? And that's almost really, to be honest with you, what defines your playing. It's not really like once you're stable and you do a lick, right? When you're... That's a pretty obvious thing, and it's something you can practice. It's when you come out of that lick and you're going to go into something else. What finger you're on and where you move to is going to define that next motion, you see. That's kind of the trick to this whole thing, and it's different for everybody. Which again is why I would strongly recommend, Gary says, that's efficiency, and like you say, Steve, it's what works for you. That's right. The more you learn to kind of slither back and forth in whatever key or whatever scale you're practicing, whatever it is that you find most important to, you know, your needs, that's kind of the trick to this whole thing is finding the way that works to move in and out of these different ideas that you've got. When I first started really learning about soloing and the fretboard and scales and things like that, long time ago, I had scales that I would study and practice, and then I had licks that I would practice. But I had no real ability of being able to kind of slide, you know, fretboard road maps is always the way I think of it, is they're just different roads, different ways to travel across a fretboard, right? Like driving cross country, there's a million ways to go wherever you want to go. And I wasn't able to do that. I could go into a scale position and play that position, and I could play a lick, but I couldn't maneuver comfortably in and out. And that's when I started learning that for me, now don't get me wrong, I play licks and patterns and sequences and all kinds of things, but they just kind of occur, like I was saying in the last class in the VIP group, I think I said this, I think about boxes, right? If I'm in a box, then that's when licks tend to happen or speed patterns tend to happen. When I start looking at the guitar more in a diagonal sense, which is more of like an arpeggio sense, right? Like we were just doing. Then this melodic thing starts kind of coming out. And then I've got my horizontal motions, which I always think about. And again, it depends on the style of music I'm playing. But love these. And then dropping into something else, right? So those three kind of maneuvers are what kind of take me around. And then when I get to somewhere, maybe I decide this is a great place for a lick or a repetitive idea, whether it's a sequence or something like that, or a pattern, whatever you want to call these things. But then I might drop into some sort of a repetitive thing and then drop back out of it. And that's kind of how you get around the fretboard, okay? Hopefully that makes sense to you. Let's see, Randolph says, for me, the positions become more of reference points. Yeah, I mean, it's just everybody's different, but the trick is now you take all of those ideas and you try and, because none of that has to do with music. All of that has to do with logistics of motion and what you see and what you understand and all those kinds of things. And then you try and take all of that and contrast that with real musical emotion. A great bend, a great vibrato, what I always call dynamic contrast, playing fast, playing slow, playing high, playing low, playing loud, playing soft. Don't play at all, right? Play pentatonic, play diatonic. It's always contrasting the things that you're doing along with this structured thing, right? And I'm not trying to confuse you or make you go, oh gosh, that sounds like too much, because it really doesn't have to be. You don't need all of these at once. You just need a few of these to explore, okay? Ron says, one of my biggest problems, frustrations, is that I come up with all kinds of cool stuff in my brain, but can't translate it. And part of it is you gotta learn to slow down, Ron, because there's so many things that take you away from a central focus. That's why the guitar is such a crazy instrument, because it goes on forever, right? And we find ourselves being drawn in all these directions all the time. This idea takes us this direction, and this thing takes us this direction, and we're just all over the place, as opposed to, it's okay, Rock, as opposed to trying to centralize your efforts, okay? Because think about it this way. If you can learn to play authentically, and I'm just going to pick on your word cool, because if you can learn to make something work, like 2 + 2 = 4, like G is played, and you play something that is functional, it's not flashy, it's not whatever, but it works, and then some other chord comes up and you play something that's functional with that, then all of a sudden you start going, oh, this is kind of cool. This is kind of neat. Then you can start adding what we could call the cool stuff on top of that, because I believe in that too. I mean, for me, the solos I love and the solos that I strive to play are ones that kind of ease you in, and then all of a sudden they just take you to the next level, and then they bring you back down, and then they bring you back up again. And that's what I love about that kind of stuff. But over the years of playing guitar as much as I have, I love the freedom of just being able to kind of flow anywhere, but at all times, I'm communicating with the music. I'm thinking about the music, and I'm trying to make a connection. And sometimes I won't. Sometimes I'll go off, and I'll just kind of get crazy, and I'm just letting the emotion run, and the electricity's going, and everything's kind of happening, and then I come back out again. You see? So, yeah. My life was spent, when I was younger, my life was spent practicing I keep pointing over here because in the earlier live session, I was talking about how I think about practice as 2 essential buckets. There's the rudimentary fundamental bucket, where we develop all these things and we learn things and we practice them and we try and develop them and make them functional and make them fast or make them clean or whatever we're doing. And then over here is the bucket that we just never seem to get to, which is the real music. This is the creative bucket, or the creative space, where we're really trying to take some of these things and we're trying to make them sound good. If you think of B.B. King versus Neil Young versus Stevie Ray Vaughan versus, Buddy or Billy Gibbons versus Eddie Van Halen versus Yngwie Malmsteen versus Joe Bonamassa versus God knows who, right? They're all vastly different from each other, doing what they do, and you might be more interested in one versus the other, and that's all perfectly fine. But they're not all trying to do all of it. They're just finding their place in this thing of life before we die and can't do it anymore. So that's kind of the trick, is trying to find the things that really make the most sense. And for me, I grew up, everything was flashy, everything was speed. I was a metal guy, and I still am today. I mean, I still play in metal bands and stuff. But I've come to really value that playing, that melodic playing, because it wasn't part of my vocabulary when I was younger. Everything was speed and trick and tap and all these different things. And don't get me wrong, I'm glad I developed those things, because I still use those in my playing, but I don't use them all the time. They're just tools that I go to in between some of the other stuff that I'm doing. And I can find myself lost for 2-3 hours just practicing this stuff that we're talking about right now. So you got to find the balance between the fundamental stuff and the creative stuff, if that makes sense. Okay? Let's see here. in a solo like Sweet Child, is that major minor sound that sound different because of chord changes? Nah, he's just, I mean, Slash he does the same thing. I mean, he creates elements that are more formulated, right? And then he's doing his, whatever. I don't remember how that solo goes, but then he's just jamming in the middle, right? And he's just doing his thing, and he's going off, and just like a lot of those players do. Like, Slash, for me, is one of those guys that fits into what I always call the drunken category, and I don't mean that literally. I mean guys like Joe Perry and Keith Richards and these guys that they just jam, and it's this sloppy way of playing, but it sounds great, right? Where then you've got the John Petrucci's and the Paul Gilberts and whatever that really aren't the sloppy players. Everything's very articulate, and they sound great. But they're two different kinds of players. They're just two different ways of playing. And I live somewhere in between all of that because I love all of those guys. I love all of that playing. Yeah, and that's the thing is everybody's different. And so that's what you're trying to do is you're trying to figure out, like when you play over a jam track, like if I play over, let me just do this quick. So if I did, I don't really have a great one in here, but if I did this is C minor. Say I just go off. So sometimes I'm trying to connect to the rhythm. Sometimes I'm just trying to play. Sometimes I'm trying to respond to those chords, which are C minor and F minor and G minor. So sometimes I'm kind of trying to move in between all those things because that's kind of what this song wants. Where if I do this is Mustang Sally, kind of. Now this wants more groove, right? Whatever, I'm trying to make some sort of connection, but that one doesn't really want, it doesn't want that melodic thing, it just wants, it wants more aggression in there, it wants more funk, more groove, right? So that's what I got to be thinking about a little bit when I'm playing over the top of that. I can still use the scales and things, but my approach might be a little bit different. Let's see, David says, what progression would you use to decipher a lead once you know the... What progression would you use to decipher a lead once you know the key? Start with pentatonic? I'm not sure if you were here earlier, David, but when I post this in the Masterclass, I'm not sure if you saw that, but you'd want to watch that because I'm not exactly sure what you're saying. What progression would you use to decipher a lead once you know the key? If I knew the key, then I would grab whatever scale is most appropriate for that key, not only for that key, but that style of music, right? If it's more of a Mustang Sally-ish thing, it's in A, But I wouldn't play A major over the top of this. I'd be playing A blues stuff, major blues, minor blues, Mixolydian, Dorian, all those things. I'd be using all of that stuff over this. So where would I start? I'd start with the key, looking at the chords, deciding which scales are probably most appropriate, and then my approach. Should it be more groove? Should it be more melodic, right? What am I trying to do with it? And then he says, if there's notes that don't exist in the scale, would you look at the chromatic or the triads? If there were, I'm not sure what notes, if there's notes from the chords that don't exist in the scale, I would add them into the scale. Or I would change keys for that particular amount of time, depending on if the chord is really odd. If you're playing pentatonic, there's always going to be notes that don't fit because you're missing some of the notes in pentatonic. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, see you guys. I'm not sure why you're losing connection. Let me take a look here. No, I should be good over on this side. Hopefully you guys can hear me. Anyway, we're coming to the end anyway, but let me know if you can hear me okay. And I'm going to post this in the Masterclass group, and you guys can use this a little bit. It might be something fun to jam over for the holidays when you're out doing whatever for Thanksgiving and you have time on your hands. Screw around a little bit and see what kind of stuff you can come up with. So, Gary says, I love your explanation of mixing minor and major scales. Yeah, it's really fun to do this stuff, guys. So thank you. Well, good. I'm glad. It looks like everybody's doing okay. So I'm going to get going here. I'm going to go have some supper, and you all have a wonderful Thanksgiving. And again, I'm going to post this right now in the Masterclass group so you guys can watch this, okay? So everybody take care and stay safe, and I'll talk to you in a little while because I'll be gone for a few days too for the holidays. So take